gavel had not even fallen yet, but Lena Ashworth already knew she had lost. She stood in the center of the grand hall at Wraithmoor, her hands folded in front of her, while 20 pairs of eyes watched her like she was a criminal on display. The chandelier above her cast a cold light across the marble floor, and every breath she took felt too loud in the silence. Across the room, seated on a raised chair like a king holding court, was her husband, the Duke of Wraithmoor, Alexander Castellane. He did not look at her. He never did anymore. "The evidence is clear," said the family lawyer, a thin man named Edmund Price, holding up a folder stuffed with papers. "The missing funds were traced to an account linked to Mrs. Ashworth. Given the circumstances, and given His Grace's wishes, we recommend the marriage be dissolved immediately, with no settlement owed to her." A murmur passed through the room like wind through dry leaves. Lena felt her chest tighten, but she did not let her face show it. She had learned, over the past year, that showing pain to this family was like showing blood to wolves. "I did not take that money," she said, her voice steady, even though her hands were shaking behind her back. "I have said this from the beginning. Someone placed those documents to make it look that way." "Convenient," sneered a voice from the side. Julian Castellane, the Duke's cousin, leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, and a smile that never reached his eyes. "An orphan girl marries into the wealthiest house in the county, and now money disappears. What a surprise." Lena's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Arguing with Julian was like arguing with a closed door. It never opened, and it only tired you out. She turned instead to the man who was supposed to be her husband, the man whose ring was on her finger, though it might as well have been a chain. "Alexander," she said quietly. It was the first time she had used his given name in months. Everyone else in the room went still. He finally looked at her. His eyes, the color of storm clouds before rain, held no warmth, only tired patience, like a man waiting for an inconvenience to end. "You have something to say?" he asked. "I am not asking you to believe me," Lena said. "I know you have already decided. I only ask for one thing, before I leave this house and never return." Julian scoffed. "Here we go." Lena ignored him. She kept her eyes on Alexander. "Allow me to cook one final meal in this house, with my own hands, in the kitchen, no servants involved, a recipe from my mother. After that, I will sign whatever papers you want, and I will walk out that door without another word." The room fell into stunned silence. Even the Dowager Duchess, seated near the front in dark green silk, raised an eyebrow. "A meal?" Alexander repeated, as though she had asked for something absurd, like a crown or a horse made of gold. "You want to cook?" "Yes." "Why?" Lena's throat tightened. She thought of her mother's tiny kitchen, the smell of butter and herbs, the only place in her whole childhood where she had ever felt safe. She thought of how, in this house, she had never once been offered comfort, not even a kind word, and she wanted, just once, to give something, instead of only losing. "Because it is the only thing I have left that is truly mine," she said. "Everything else, this house has already taken." Alexander studied her for a long moment. The room waited. Julian looked like he wanted to laugh, but something in the Duke's expression stopped him. "Fine," Alexander said finally, waving a hand as if swatting away a fly. "Cook your meal, then sign the papers and go." It was not kindness. Lena understood that much. It was mockery, a small and cheap way to remind her that even this request was granted only because it did not matter to him. But she did not care about his reasons. She only nodded, turned, and walked out of the hall with her spine straight, refusing to let anyone see her hands were still trembling. The kitchen at Wraithmoor was enormous, built for a staff of a dozen cooks, all steel counters and towering shelves and copper pots hanging from the ceiling like sleeping bells. It was nothing like her mother's kitchen, which had been the size of a closet, with a single window that let in morning light and the smell of the bakery next door. But Lena did not need a grand kitchen. She needed a fire, a pot, and a memory. She sent the kitchen staff away, gently but firmly, and gathered the few simple things she required: potatoes, onions, a little butter, fresh herbs she had grown herself in a small pot on her balcony, the only piece of her old life she had managed to keep alive in this cold house. Nothing fancy, nothing that belonged on a duke's table. Her mother used to make this dish on the coldest nights, when there was no money for anything else, and somehow it always tasted like more than what it was. Lena remembered standing on a wooden stool as a child, stirring the pot, while her mother hummed an old tune, telling her that food made with care could reach a person in places words could not. She had never truly believed that until tonight, when it was the only weapon she had left. As she worked, her mind drifted, unwillingly, to the day she had married Alexander. It had not been a choice, not really. Her father's failing business had been quietly saved by an arrangement between families, and Lena, 18 years old and freshly orphaned by her mother's passing, had been the price. She remembered the wedding, cold and formal, Alexander barely looking at her even as he placed the ring on her finger. She remembered thinking, foolishly, that perhaps with time, something warm might grow between them. Nothing had grown, only distance, and now, an accusation that would end it all. She chopped the onions slowly, letting the sting in her eyes give her an excuse for the tears that threatened to fall anyway. Dinner was served in the small private dining room, not the grand hall, because Alexander had insisted he would not sit through a ceremony for a woman on her way out the door. Only he was present, seated at the head of a table far too large for one person, when Lena entered carrying a single dish covered with a plain cloth. She set it before him without a word, then stepped back, waiting. Alexander glanced at the plain white plate, the simple, humble food upon it, so unlike the elaborate dishes his chefs prepared nightly with foam and gold leaf and towers of unnecessary decoration. For a moment, something like disdain crossed his face. "This is it?" he asked. "Taste it before you judge it," Lena said quietly. He raised an eyebrow at her tone, unused to being spoken to so plainly by anyone, let alone the wife he had spent a year ignoring. But something in her steady gaze made him pick up the fork instead of dismissing her outright. He took a small bite, and then he stopped moving entirely. The taste hit him before he understood why it mattered. It was simple, warm, slightly imperfect in the way that only home cooking could be. But underneath the taste was something else, something he could not immediately name. A memory, perhaps, or the ghost of one. A feeling of being small and safe, in a place that no longer existed. He set his fork down slowly. "Where did you learn this recipe?" he asked, and his voice had lost some of its usual coldness. "My mother," Lena said. "She used to make it when we had nothing else. She said food should feel like being held, even when no one else was there to hold you." Alexander said nothing for a long moment. His eyes stayed fixed on the plate, but his thoughts had gone somewhere far away, somewhere Lena could not follow. "You may go," he said finally, his voice quiet, not cruel, just distant. Lena bowed her head slightly and left the room, assuming this was the end of it. She had done what she came to do. Tomorrow, she would sign the papers and leave Wraithmore forever. She did not know that Alexander sat at that table for another hour, staring at the empty plate, remembering a version of himself that had existed before every warmth in his life had been replaced with duty, obligation, and the cold architecture of a family that valued appearances over affection. She did not know that when he finally rose from the table, he did not call for the papers to be finalized. He called for his study to be locked, and told his assistant that the divorce proceedings were to be delayed, effective immediately, until further notice. The next morning, Lena packed her few belongings into a single trunk, expecting to be summoned to sign the final papers before noon. Instead, she was met at her door by Nora, the young maid who had quietly become the only friend she had in this house. "They are saying it is delayed," Nora whispered, glancing over her shoulder to make sure no one else was listening. "The signing. His Grace has not given a reason." Lena frowned, confused. Delayed? Why would he delay something he wants so badly? Nora shook her head, just as puzzled. "I do not know, but the whole house is talking about it. Mr. Price came this morning demanding an explanation, and His Grace sent him away without one." Lena sat down slowly on the edge of her bed, trying to make sense of it. Perhaps it was simply bureaucracy, some legal detail that needed correcting. Perhaps it meant nothing at all. But a small, cautious part of her wondered if it meant something had shifted, however slightly, in the man who had never once looked at her with anything but tolerance. She told herself not to hope. Hope, in this house, had only ever led to disappointment. Still, As she sat there with her trunk half-packed and her future uncertain again, she found herself thinking of the look on his face the moment he tasted her mother's recipe. For one instant, the cold Duke had looked almost human. She did not yet know what that moment would set into motion. She only knew that, for the first time since arriving at Wraithmore, the walls of this house did not feel quite so permanent. Outside her window, the morning fog rolled over the estate grounds, hiding the gardens and the long gravel drive that led away from this place. Somewhere in that fog, her future waited, uncertain and unwritten, and for reasons she could not explain, Lena found she was no longer in a hurry to walk toward it. Later that afternoon, she found herself unable to sit still in her room any longer. The trunk sat half-packed by the door, a silent reminder that her fate was still, somehow, unsettled. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and walked out into the garden, needing air, needing space, away from the heavy silence of the house. The gardens at Wraithmore were vast, far larger than anything she had known growing up, with hedges trimmed into perfect shapes and fountains that never seemed to stop running. She had always found them beautiful in a distant sort of way, like paintings she was allowed to look at but never truly touch. She walked along the gravel path until she reached the old stone bench near the edge of the property, half hidden behind a row of tall rose bushes. It was the one place on the estate that felt forgotten enough to be hers. She sat down and closed her eyes, letting the cool air settle her thoughts. She thought of her mother again, of the small kitchen, of the years before everything became about contracts and money and family names. She wondered what her mother would think if she could see her now, sitting in a garden larger than their entire old street, feeling more alone than she ever had in poverty. Footsteps on the gravel made her open her eyes. It was Alexander. He stopped a short distance away, hands clasped behind his back, looking as though he had not expected to find her there either. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "I did not think you would still be here," he said finally. "The papers have not been signed," Lena replied evenly. "I assumed I was still required to stay until they were." He nodded slowly, his eyes moving briefly toward the roses before returning to her. "The delay is my doing. There were some matters I wished to look into before finalizing things." "What matters?" He hesitated, and for a moment, Lena thought he might actually answer honestly. But the familiar wall came back up behind his eyes, and he simply said, "Matters that do not concern you yet." She almost laughed at the strangeness of it. A man delaying the end of a marriage he had wanted over for months, offering no explanation, standing in a garden as though he had wandered there by accident rather than intention. "If you have changed your mind about the divorce," she said carefully, "you may simply say so." "I have not changed my mind," he said quickly. Too quickly, perhaps because something flickered across his face right after, some small crack in his own certainty. Lena studied him for a moment, unable to read what lay beneath his carefully composed expression. "Then I do not understand the delay." "Neither do I, entirely," he admitted, so quietly she almost missed it. It was the most honest thing he had ever said to her. Before she could respond, he turned and walked back toward the house, leaving her alone among the roses, with more questions than she had arrived with. The Dowager Duchess Helena Castellane did not raise her voice often. She did not need to. A single cold sentence from her could silence a room faster than any shout. "Explain to me," she said, sitting stiffly in her private sitting room, "why the divorce has been delayed." Alexander stood near the window, his hands clasped behind his back, refusing to meet his mother's eyes. "There were irregularities in the paperwork. Mr. Price is correcting them." "Do not lie to me," Helena said sharply. "I raised you. I know when you are hiding something. This began the night that girl cooked for you." Alexander's jaw tightened. "This has nothing to do with a meal." "Then it has everything to do with weakness," Helena snapped, rising from her chair. "You cannot allow sentiment to undo everything this family has built. That girl was brought into this house to solve a financial problem, and now she has become one herself. The sooner she leaves, the sooner this family can move forward." "She may not have stolen anything at all," Alexander said, the words leaving his mouth before he had fully decided to say them. Helena's eyes narrowed. "What did you say?" "I said we do not actually know the truth of what happened," Alexander replied, steadier now. "The evidence was convenient. Almost too convenient. I intend to look into it properly before anything is finalized." "You intend to protect her," Helena said, her voice cold with disbelief. "After everything Julian uncovered." "Julian uncovered nothing," Alexander said. "He simply presented conclusions that suited him." Helena stared at her son for a long moment, as though seeing something in him she had never noticed before. "This is dangerous, Alexander. Do not let a moment of doubt cost this family its stability." "I am not asking your permission," Alexander said quietly, and for the first time in a long while, he meant it. He left the room before she could respond, his mind churning with thoughts he had not allowed himself to have in months. Meanwhile, in the servants' quarters, Nora was gathering courage she had carried silently for weeks. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, twisting her apron in her hands, thinking of the conversation she had overheard 3 nights ago between Julian and one of the estate's junior clerks. At the time, she had told herself it was not her business. She had told herself that speaking up would cost her position, perhaps even her home. She was an orphan too, much like Lena, with nowhere else to go if she lost her place at Wraithmore. But every day she watched Lena carry the weight of an accusation that was not hers to bear, and every day the guilt inside Nora grew heavier than her fear. She thought of her own mother, long past, who had always told her that silence in the face of injustice was its own kind of unkindness. That night, unable to sleep, Nora made her decision. Lena, unaware of the storm building quietly around her, spent the following days in a strange limbo. She was neither dismissed nor welcomed, neither wife nor stranger. She kept mostly to her room, tending to her small pot of herbs on the balcony, wondering when the papers would finally arrive for her signature. Instead of papers, what arrived was an invitation. A folded note, delivered by a young footman, requesting her presence at dinner that evening. Not in the small private dining room, where she had served him days before, but in the formal dining hall, where she had once stood accused before the entire household. She stared at the note for a long time before deciding to attend, curiosity outweighing her caution. The formal dining hall looked different that evening. Fewer candles burned than during the hearing, casting long, soft shadows instead of harsh light. Only 2 places were set at the enormous table, close to each other rather than at opposite ends. Alexander was already seated when she arrived, and he rose slightly as she entered, a small formality she had never seen him offer before. "You wish to see me?" Lena asked carefully, taking the seat across from him. "I wish to speak with you," he corrected, away from the rest of the household. She waited, unsure what to expect. "I have begun looking into the circumstances surrounding the missing funds," he said, "more carefully than I did before." Lena's breath caught slightly. "And what have you found?" "Not enough, yet," he admitted, "but enough to make me uncertain that the conclusions we reached were correct." She studied his face, searching for mockery, for some trick hidden beneath his words. She found none. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked quietly. "You do not owe me an explanation." "No," he agreed, "but I find that I want to give you one anyway." The silence between them stretched, not uncomfortable, but heavy, with things neither of them yet knew how to say. A servant entered briefly to pour wine, and once he left, Alexander spoke again, his voice lower. "The dish you cooked," he said, "I have not been able to stop thinking about it." Lena blinked, surprised by the sudden shift. "It was only a simple recipe." "Perhaps," he said, "but it reminded me of something I had forgotten I ever had. A feeling, rather than a memory. I do not fully understand it myself." Lena did not know how to respond to something so unlike the man she had known for the past year. She settled instead for honesty. "My mother used to say that food carries more truth than words ever do. Perhaps that is all it was." "Perhaps," Alexander said again, though his eyes lingered on her in a way that suggested he did not fully believe it was that simple. They ate in a silence that felt different from all the silences before it. Not cold, not distant, something quieter, something new, something neither of them was ready to name. Later that night, alone in her room, Lena sat by the window, watching the moonlight fall across the garden below. She thought of the dinner, of the strange softness in Alexander's voice, of the way he had looked at her, as though seeing her for the very first time. She reminded herself, firmly, not to hope. Hope had cost her too much before. But as she lay down to sleep, she could not fully silence the small, stubborn part of her heart that wondered if something at Wraithmoor was finally beginning to change. The following morning brought an unexpected visitor to Wraithmoor. Clara Whitmore, Lena's oldest friend from the small town where she had grown up, arrived unannounced, her carriage rattling up the long gravel drive just after breakfast. She had heard, through a mutual acquaintance, that Lena was facing accusations serious enough to end her marriage, and she had traveled 2 full days to see for herself that her friend was safe. Lena met her in the front hall, and the moment she saw Clara's familiar face, framed by the same auburn curls she remembered from childhood, something in her chest loosened for the first time in weeks. "You look thinner," Clara said immediately, pulling her into a tight embrace. "And tired. What have they been doing to you, in this enormous cold house?" "It is a long story," Lena said, managing a small, tired smile. They walked together to the garden, away from listening ears, and Lena told her everything. The accusation, the hearing, the strange request for one final meal, the even stranger delay that followed. Clara listened with growing disbelief, shaking her head at several points. "A duke who ignored you for a year is suddenly delaying your divorce because of dinner." "It sounds foolish when you say it like that," Lena admitted. "It sounds like something is shifting," Clara said thoughtfully. "Men like that do not act without reason, even when they themselves do not understand the reason yet." Lena sighed, sitting down on the same stone bench where she had spoken with Alexander days before. "I do not know what to think anymore. Part of me wants to leave this house and never look back. Another part of me wants to know the truth of what happened to me, and why." "Perhaps both can be true," Clara said gently. "You do not have to forgive this family to want justice from them." Lena appreciated the clarity in her friend's words, the way Clara always managed to say exactly what needed to be said, without dressing it up in comfort that would only soften the truth. "There is something else," Lena said quietly. "A young maid here, Nora, has been acting strangely, nervous, like she wants to tell me something, but cannot find the courage." Clara's eyes sharpened with interest. "Then perhaps you should give her a reason to find that courage." That evening, Lena sought out Nora in the quiet corridor near the servants' stairs, where she often saw the young maid pass with baskets of linens. "Nora," she said softly, catching her before she disappeared into the stairwell. "May I speak with you a moment?" Nora froze, her eyes wide with something that looked very much like fear. "Of course, my lady." "I am not asking as your mistress," Lena said gently. "I am asking as someone who considers you a friend in this house, perhaps the only one I have. If there is something weighing on you, you may tell me. I will not let harm come to you for it." Nora's composure cracked slightly, her hands tightening around the basket she carried. "I have wanted to say something for weeks," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" Nora glanced around the empty corridor before answering. "Afraid of Master Julian." Lena's heart began to pound. "What do you know, Nora?" The young maid hesitated, tears welling in her eyes. "I heard him speaking with one of the estate clerks, weeks before the accusation was made against you. They spoke of moving funds, of making it look as though the transfers came from your account. I did not understand it fully at the time. I only understood it later, once the accusation became public." Lena felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her feet, relief and fury crashing through her at the same time. "Why did you not come forward sooner?" "I was afraid of losing my place here," Nora said, tears finally spilling over. "I have nowhere else to go, my lady. I am sorry. I should have said something the moment I understood what it meant for you." Lena reached out and took the young woman's trembling hands in her own. "You are telling me now. That matters more than you know." "What will you do?" Nora asked. Lena thought of Alexander's words the night before, his admission that he was no longer certain of the conclusions reached about her. She thought of the strange, fragile shift beginning between them, and she wondered if this was the piece that would either strengthen it or shatter it entirely. "I will tell the Duke," she said finally. "Tonight." Alexander was in his study when Lena knocked, later than propriety usually allowed, but she had not wanted to wait until morning. Every hour felt like a risk that Julian might discover what Nora had revealed and silence her before the truth could reach anyone who mattered. "Come in," he called, surprised to see her at this hour. She entered and closed the door behind her, something in her expression making him rise immediately from his desk. "What has happened?" he asked. I have learned something, Lena said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. Something about the missing funds, and who truly moved them. Alexander's expression shifted from surprise to sharp attention. Tell me. She recounted everything Nora had shared, careful to protect the young maid's courage by explaining that she had come forward willingly, out of guilt, and deserved protection, rather than punishment for her earlier silence. Alexander listened without interrupting, his jaw growing tighter with every sentence. By the time she finished, his hands had curled into fists at his sides. Julian, he said, the name leaving his mouth like something bitter. I do not know for certain that it was him, Lena said carefully. Only that the maid overheard a conversation that suggests funds were moved to appear, as though they came from my account. It is enough to begin a proper investigation, Alexander said, already moving toward his desk to retrieve paper and ink. I should have done this the moment the accusation was made, rather than accepting it so easily. Why did you accept it so easily? Lena asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Alexander paused, his hand resting on the edge of the desk. For a long moment, he said nothing, and Lena wondered if she had overstepped some invisible line between them. Because it was simpler, he admitted finally, his voice quiet. Because believing you guilty required nothing further from me. No further attention. No further involvement in a marriage I never wanted in the first place. The honesty in his words struck her harder than she expected. She had known, in some distant way, that this was likely the truth, but hearing it spoken aloud carried a different weight entirely. And now, she asked. Now I find that simplicity has cost me something I did not expect to value, he said, his eyes meeting hers directly, for the first time that evening. Your name, your dignity, perhaps more than that. Lena did not know how to respond to such an admission, from a man who had spent an entire year treating her as an inconvenience rather than a person. She settled for the only response she could manage. Then help me prove the truth, she said, not for my sake alone, but because it is right. I intend to, Alexander said, beginning tomorrow. The following days passed in a flurry of quiet investigation. Alexander enlisted the estate's most trusted clerk, a careful man named Edwin Foley who had served the family for over 20 years, to review the financial records with fresh eyes. Lena, though not formally involved in the investigation, found herself drawn into long conversations with Alexander each evening, discussing what had been found, what remained uncertain, and slowly, unexpectedly, discussing things that had nothing to do with the investigation at all. They spoke of her childhood, of her mother's small kitchen, and the years of quiet hardship that had shaped her. She spoke of dreams she had once carried, before circumstances forced her into a marriage of convenience, dreams of perhaps opening a small kitchen of her own one day, a place where others could feel the comfort she had always found in food. Alexander listened more closely than she expected, asking questions that revealed genuine curiosity, rather than polite obligation. In turn, he spoke, haltingly at first, of his own childhood, of a mother who measured affection in usefulness rather than love, and a father who had valued heirs and reputation far above warmth. He spoke of years spent learning to want nothing, because wanting only led to disappointment in a house built on duty rather than feeling. Lena found herself understanding him in a way she had not expected to. The coldness she had once resented in him began to look, from this new angle, less like cruelty, and more like a wound carried since childhood, one he had never learned how to heal. You never had a meal like the one I cooked, she said one evening, the realization striking her suddenly. Not once, growing up. Alexander's silence answered the question more clearly than words could have. Then perhaps, Lena said softly, it was not the recipe that moved you. Perhaps it was simply the first time anyone cooked for you with care instead of obligation. Alexander looked at her for a long moment, something unguarded flickering behind his eyes. Perhaps, he said quietly. I had not considered it that way. Neither of them spoke further that evening, but something between them had shifted again, quietly, the way ice begins to melt long before anyone notices the water beneath it. Not everyone in the house welcomed this quiet transformation. Julian, sensing the growing closeness between Alexander and Lena, watched with narrowing suspicion, uncertain how much the young maid Nora had truly revealed, and increasingly aware that his carefully built scheme might soon come apart entirely. He began, subtly at first, planting doubts among the household staff, suggesting that Lena's sudden influence over the Duke was less about innocence and more about manipulation. He spoke quietly with the Dowager Duchess, feeding her existing distrust with fresh, unfounded worries. He did not yet know that Edwin Foley, the trusted clerk, had already discovered a trail of altered records leading directly back to instructions given under his own name. The truth was closer than Julian realized, and it was moving faster than his careful lies could contain. Edwin Foley arrived at the study door earlier than expected, his usually calm face pale with the weight of what he carried. Alexander waved him in immediately, sensing that whatever the clerk had discovered was significant. "Your Grace," Edwin said, closing the door behind him and lowering his voice out of old habit, even though no one else was near. "I have found something I believe you must see immediately." He spread a series of documents across the desk, pointing to a set of transfer records dated several weeks before the accusation against Lena had been made public. "These transfers," Edwin explained, "were authorized using a signature that appears to be Mrs. Ashworth's. However, when compared against her actual signature on the marriage documents, the differences are subtle, but present. A trained eye would notice them immediately." Alexander leaned forward, studying the documents carefully. "Forged." "I believe so, Your Grace. And there is more." Edwin produced a second set of papers. The account these funds were transferred into was opened only 4 months ago, under a name that traces back, through several intermediary steps, to Master Julian's personal solicitor. The room went silent for a long moment. Alexander sat back slowly in his chair, his expression unreadable, though his hands had curled into fists once more. "You are certain of this," he said, not quite a question. "As certain as the paperwork allows, Your Grace. I would recommend a formal audit before any confrontation, simply to ensure the evidence cannot be disputed." Alexander nodded slowly. "Proceed with the audit, quietly. I do not want Julian aware of how close we are, until the evidence is undeniable." Edwin bowed and left the study, leaving Alexander alone with the weight of what he now knew. His own cousin, a man he had grown up alongside, had orchestrated the ruin of an innocent woman's reputation, and he himself had accepted it without question, too consumed by his own resentment toward a marriage he never wanted to look closely enough at the truth. The guilt of that realization sat heavier in his chest than he expected. That evening, unable to settle his thoughts, Alexander found himself walking the halls of Wraithmore long after most of the household had retired. He passed by the small private dining room, where Lena had first served him her mother's recipe, and something made him stop and step inside. The room was empty and dark, save for moonlight spilling through the tall windows. He stood there for a long while, remembering the taste of that simple meal, the way it had cracked something open in him that he had spent years keeping carefully sealed. He thought of his childhood, of meals eaten in silence at a table far too large for the emptiness that filled it. He thought of a mother who complimented him only when he achieved something useful, and a father who spoke to him more like an investment than a son. He thought of the years he had spent building walls so thick that even affection, when it appeared, could not find a way through. And he thought of Lena, standing in this very room, asking for nothing but the chance to offer something small and honest, before she left his life forever. He found Nora in the corridor near the kitchen, still awake, likely too anxious to sleep after revealing what she knew. "Thank you," he said simply, the words unfamiliar in his mouth after so long spent speaking only in commands and expectations. "For your courage. It could not have been easy." Nora blinked in surprise, unused to gratitude from the Duke of Wraithmore. "I only did what was right, Your Grace." "Not everyone finds the courage to do what is right, even when they know it," Alexander said. "You will not lose your position here. You have my word." Nora's eyes filled with quiet relief. "Thank you, Your Grace." As she disappeared toward the servants' quarters, Alexander stood alone in the dim corridor, feeling, for the first time in longer than he could remember, something close to purpose. Meanwhile, Lena sat awake in her own room, unable to settle despite the exhaustion pressing at her eyes. The events of the past days had unsettled something within her that she had thought long buried: hope. She had spent so long training herself not to expect kindness from this house that its sudden appearance felt almost frightening, as though she might reach for it only to have it vanish the moment she believed in it too completely. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Alexander standing there, something different in his posture, something less guarded than she had ever seen from him. "I wanted to tell you myself," he said. "We have found evidence, real evidence," pointing toward Julian. Lena's breath caught. "Then it is true. I was never guilty of anything." "You were never guilty of anything," Alexander confirmed, his voice quiet but firm. "And I am sorry it took me this long to seek the truth properly." Lena felt something loosen in her chest, relief mixing with an ache she had carried silently for months. "Thank you for telling me." They stood there for a long moment, the corridor quiet around them, something unspoken passing between them, that neither yet had the words to name. "Good night, Lena," Alexander said finally, using her given name for the first time, without any trace of coldness in his voice. "Good night, Alexander," she replied softly, watching him disappear down the corridor before closing her door and leaning against it, her heart pounding with something that felt, for the first time in a long while, like hope she was finally allowed to keep. Julian noticed the shift before he could name it exactly. Servants who once whispered behind Lena's back now offered her polite nods in the corridors. Edwin Foley, usually a man who kept to his ledgers and rarely left his office, had been seen entering the Duke's study 3 times in a single week. And Alexander himself, the cousin Julian had known since childhood, had begun looking at him with a coolness that had nothing to do with their usual rivalry. Something was wrong, and Julian's instincts, sharpened by years of careful scheming, told him it was closing in around him. He decided to act before the situation could slip entirely from his control. He found Lena alone in the garden one afternoon, tending to the small pot of herbs she had moved outside to catch more sunlight. She looked up as he approached, her expression guarded but no longer as fearful as it had once been. "Enjoying your extended stay?" Julian asked, his tone light but his eyes sharp. "I am simply waiting for the truth to be confirmed," Lena replied evenly, refusing to give him the reaction he seemed to be searching for. "The truth," Julian repeated, a humorless smile tugging at his mouth. "How convenient that the truth now seems to favor you, after months of evidence pointing so clearly in the opposite direction." "Evidence can be manufactured," Lena said quietly. "As I imagine you already know." Julian's smile faltered for just a moment before he recovered it. "Careful, Mrs. Ashworth. Accusations without proof can be dangerous for the one making them." "I have made no accusations," Lena said. "I have only observed that convenient evidence rarely appears by accident." Julian studied her for a long moment, something calculating behind his eyes. "You have grown bold since gaining my cousin's favor. I wonder how long that favor will last, once the excitement of this little rescue fades." Alexander has never kept interest in anything for long, not people, not causes, certainly not wives he never wanted. The words were meant to wound, and despite herself, Lena felt them land somewhere tender, but she refused to let it show. "Then it seems we shall both discover the truth of that together," she said calmly, turning back to her herbs, effectively ending the conversation. Julian left the garden with his jaw tight, more convinced than ever that time was running short. That evening, Julian summoned the same estate clerk he had spoken with weeks before, the conversation Nora had overheard from the shadows of the corridor. This time, he met the man not within the house, but in a quiet tavern, several miles from Wraithmore, believing distance would offer protection from prying ears. He did not know that Edwin Foley's investigation had already traced the falsified account back to this very clerk, and that 2 of Alexander's most trusted men were watching the tavern from a discreet distance that very evening. "They are asking questions," Julian said quietly, sliding a folded note across the table. "You must ensure nothing further can be traced back to either of us." The clerk, sweating despite the cool evening air, nodded nervously. "I have already destroyed what records I could. Destroy the rest," Julian said, immediately. Unbeknownst to either of them, one of Alexander's men had already secured copies of the original documents days earlier, anticipating exactly this kind of desperate cleanup. The following morning, Alexander called a private meeting in his study, inviting only Edwin Foley, his most trusted steward, and, after a moment of consideration, Lena herself. "You have found something further," Lena said, reading the tension in his expression the moment she entered. "We have confirmation," Alexander said grimly. "Julian met with the clerk last night, instructing him to destroy the falsified records. My men witnessed the meeting and secured copies of the original documents beforehand." Lena's hand rose briefly to her mouth, relief and anger mixing together. "Then it is proven, completely." "As proven as it can be," Edwin confirmed. "The signature analysis, the account records, and now a witnessed attempt to destroy evidence. Taken together, it forms an undeniable case." Alexander's expression hardened with a resolve Lena had not seen in him before. "It is time to end this." "How do you intend to proceed?" Lena asked. "Publicly," Alexander said. "The accusation against you was made in front of the entire household. The truth will be revealed the same way." Lena felt a complicated mixture of relief and apprehension at the thought of standing once more in that grand hall, though this time, she would not be the one on trial. "When?" she asked. "Tomorrow evening," Alexander said. "I will not give Julian further opportunity to maneuver." That night, unable to sleep, Lena found herself once again in the garden, beneath a sky scattered with stars she rarely had time to notice within the walls of Wraithmoor. She thought of everything that had led her to this moment: the arranged marriage, the cold months of indifference, the accusation that had nearly destroyed everything she had left. And now, on the edge of vindication, a strange, fragile warmth growing between her and the man who had once seemed incapable of offering her anything at all. She did not yet know what would happen after the truth was revealed, whether Alexander's newfound warmth toward her was simply guilt over past cruelty, or something deeper beginning to take root. She only knew that, for the first time since arriving at Wraithmoor, she felt as though the ground beneath her was solid enough to stand on. Tomorrow would bring the truth into the light. What came after that, she could not yet predict. The grand hall filled quickly the following evening, word having spread through the household that the Duke intended to make an announcement regarding the accusations against his wife. Lena stood near the front of the room, dressed simply but with her shoulders straight, refusing to let nerves show on her face the way they had during the original hearing. Julian arrived last, his usual confidence intact, though his eyes flicked briefly toward Edwin Foley, standing near the Duke's chair, with a leather folder tucked beneath his arm. Alexander entered and took his place at the front of the hall, his expression composed but firm. The room fell silent as he raised a hand. "Several weeks ago," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the hall, "an accusation was made against my wife, Lena Ashworth, regarding the disappearance of funds from this estate. That accusation led to a hearing in this very room, where I allowed judgment to be passed based on evidence I did not examine closely enough." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Julian's expression remained still, though his jaw had tightened slightly. "Since that hearing," Alexander continued, "I have conducted a thorough investigation into the true source of those funds, and the true origin of the evidence used against her." He nodded to Edwin, who stepped forward and opened the leather folder. "The transfer documents used to implicate Mrs. Ashworth," Edwin announced, "contain a forged signature. A comparison with her verified signature reveals clear inconsistencies. Furthermore, the account into which the funds were moved was opened under an assumed name, traced through legal records to a solicitor employed personally by Master Julian Castellane." A wave of shocked whispers spread through the hall. Julian's composure finally cracked, his face paling. "This is absurd," he said, stepping forward. "You would take the word of a clerk over the evidence already presented?" "I would take the word of verified documentation," Alexander said coldly, "along with a witnessed meeting last night, in which you personally instructed the same clerk to destroy remaining evidence linking the account to your name." The room fell utterly silent. Julian's eyes darted around the hall, searching for support that was rapidly disappearing from every face turned toward him. "You cannot prove any of this," he said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "I can," Alexander said, "and I have already summoned the magistrate to review the full evidence formally. Whatever your reasons for orchestrating this against Lena, you will answer for them properly, through the law, rather than through rumor and manipulation within these walls." Julian's gaze finally landed on Lena, standing quiet and steady near the front of the room. For a moment, something like genuine hatred flickered across his face, before he mastered it back into cold composure. "You have made your choice, cousin," he said to Alexander, his voice tight. "Choosing an outsider over your own blood. I have chosen the truth," Alexander said simply. "Something you clearly value, far less than I once assumed." Two of the estate's guards stepped forward at Alexander's quiet signal, escorting Julian from the hall to await the magistrate's arrival. He left without further protest, though the look he cast back toward Lena carried a warning that made her skin prickle, even as relief flooded through her at the same time. Once the hall had emptied and the household had scattered into hushed, urgent conversations about what they had just witnessed, Alexander found Lena standing quietly near the tall windows, watching the last of the evening light fade over the estate grounds. "It is done," he said softly, coming to stand beside her. "It is done," she echoed, though her voice trembled slightly with the weight of everything that had just been lifted from her shoulders. "I am sorry," Alexander said, the words simple but carrying more sincerity than she had ever heard from him, "for believing the worst of you so easily, for the months of coldness before that. You deserved better from the very beginning of this marriage, long before any accusation was ever made." Lena turned to look at him fully, searching his face for any trace of the distant, dismissive man she had first married. She found instead someone who looked, for the first time, genuinely uncertain of himself. "Thank you for correcting it," she said quietly, even if it took longer than it should have. They stood together in silence for a long moment, the weight of the evening settling around them, along with something new and fragile that neither of them yet knew how to name. "What happens now?" Lena asked finally. Alexander considered the question carefully before answering. "Now, I believe, we have a great deal to discuss. About this marriage. About what it has been, and what it might become, if you are willing to consider it." Lena's heart beat unevenly at the quiet vulnerability in his voice. So different from the cold indifference she had endured for so long. "I am willing to listen," she said. "That much I can offer." For the first time since her arrival at Wraithmore, Alexander offered her a small, genuine smile. "That is more than I deserve tonight. But I intend to earn more than listening, in time." They walked from the hall together, not as strangers bound by a contract neither had chosen, but as two people standing, however uncertainly, at the beginning of something neither of them had expected to find. The magistrate, a stern man named Frederick Doyle, arrived at Wraithmore 2 days later, his carriage rolling up the long drive just as the morning frost was beginning to melt from the grass. He spent the better part of the day reviewing the evidence Edwin Foley had compiled, questioning the clerk who had assisted Julian, and confirming the forged signatures against Lena's verified handwriting. By evening, his conclusion was clear and formally recorded. Julian Castellane would face charges of fraud and forgery, with his access to the family estate and any future inheritance suspended pending trial. He would be permitted to await proceedings under limited confinement at a distant family property, far from Wraithmore, and far from any further opportunity to interfere with the household he had so carefully tried to manipulate. Julian received the news with cold silence, offering no confession, no apology, only a final, lingering look toward Alexander that carried more resentment than regret. "You will regret choosing her over your own family," he said quietly, as the guards prepared to escort him to the waiting carriage. "I have chosen honesty over deception," Alexander replied evenly. "If that feels like a betrayal to you, then perhaps you never understood what family was meant to be." Julian said nothing further, and within the hour, he was gone from Wraithmore entirely, leaving behind a house that felt, for the first time in years, lighter without his presence. The Dowager Duchess did not take the news easily. She summoned Alexander to her sitting room that same evening, her composure noticeably shaken beneath her usual icy control. "My own nephew," she said quietly, staring at nothing in particular, "orchestrating such deception under this very roof." "I know this is difficult to accept," Alexander said gently, taking a seat across from her. "I encouraged you to remove that girl from this house," Helena said, her voice tight. "I believed the evidence, without question, just as you did." "We were both wrong," Alexander said. "It is not too late to correct it." Helena was quiet for a long moment, her gaze finally lifting to meet her son's. "What do you intend to do now? About the marriage?" Alexander hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I intend to give it the chance it never truly had. Lena deserves better than the arrangement she was given, and I find that I want to offer her better, not out of obligation, but because I have come to care for her far more than I expected to." Helena studied him for a long moment, something shifting behind her composed expression. "I have spent my life believing that affection weakens a family's standing. Perhaps I was wrong about that as well." It was not quite an apology, but for Helena Castellane, it was as close as she had ever come to admitting fault, and Alexander recognized it as the small, significant step it was. News of Julian's disgrace spread quickly through the county, carried by servants, tradesmen, and the ever-eager local gossip networks that thrived on scandal involving noble families. Within days, the story had transformed and multiplied, as such stories always did, until half the county believed Lena had uncovered the plot herself through clever detective work, while the other half insisted the Duke had fallen so completely under her influence that he could refuse her nothing. Lena found the attention uncomfortable, unused to being the subject of admiration rather than suspicion. She kept mostly to the estate grounds during those first days, avoiding the curious glances of visitors who arrived under thin pretenses, simply hoping to catch sight of the woman at the center of Wraithmoor's latest scandal. Clara, still visiting from her hometown, found the whole situation rather amusing. "You have become quite the legend," she teased one afternoon, as they walked together through the gardens. The clever wife who outsmarted a scheming cousin and won over an ice-hearted duke. "I did very little outsmarting," Lena said, laughing despite herself. Nora found the courage to speak. Edwin found the evidence. "I simply asked for one final meal." "And look what that meal started," Clara said, grinning. "Perhaps you should write down that recipe properly. It seems to hold more power than either of us realized." Lena smiled at the thought, though beneath the humor, a quieter question lingered in her mind. What exactly had changed between her and Alexander? Was it truly affection growing between them, or simply guilt transformed into kindness, gratitude mistaken for something deeper? She did not yet trust herself to know the difference, not after a year of coldness that had taught her to expect very little from the man she had married. That evening, Alexander found her in the small private dining room once again, the same space where everything between them had first begun to shift. "I have been thinking," he said, taking a seat across from her, "about what comes next for us." "So have I," Lena admitted. "I do not wish for you to feel obligated to remain here, simply because the accusation against you has been cleared," he said carefully. "You are free to leave, with a full settlement and my sincere apology, if that is truly what you wish." Lena studied him carefully, searching for any trace of relief or reluctance beneath his words, and found only quiet sincerity. "And if I do not wish to leave?" she asked softly. Something flickered across Alexander's face, hope carefully restrained beneath years of guarded habit. "Then I would like the chance to build something real between us. Not the arrangement we were given, but something chosen freely, by both of us." Lena's heart beat unevenly at the vulnerability in his voice, so unlike the distant man she had first known. "I am not yet certain what I want," she admitted honestly. "Everything has changed so quickly." "Take whatever time you need," Alexander said. "I am not asking for an answer tonight. Only for the chance to earn one, eventually." Lena nodded slowly, grateful for the space he offered, even as something warm and uncertain continued to grow quietly within her chest. The weeks that followed brought a quiet, careful rhythm to Wraithmoor that Lena had never known within its walls before. Alexander, true to his word, did not press her for answers she was not ready to give. Instead, he showed up in small, steady ways that gradually chipped away at the walls she had built during a year of loneliness. He began joining her in the mornings when she tended to her herbs on the balcony, asking questions about which ones she used for which dishes, admitting he knew almost nothing about cooking, beyond eating whatever was placed before him. She taught him, patiently, the names of thyme and rosemary, and the small purple flowers that bloomed on her chive plants, and found herself laughing, genuinely and without caution, for the first time in longer than she could remember. He accompanied her on walks through the estate grounds, no longer distant or distracted, but present in a way that surprised her each time. He asked about her mother, her childhood, the dreams she had once carried before circumstances rearranged her life entirely. And in turn, he shared more of himself than she had ever expected from a man who once seemed made entirely of cold formality. One afternoon, as they walked past the old stone bench near the roses, Alexander stopped and turned to her with a seriousness that made her pause as well. "I want to show you something," he said, "if you are willing." Curious, she followed him back toward the main house, through corridors she had rarely walked, until they reached a small, disused room on the estate's ground floor. It had clearly once been some kind of study or sitting room, though it had been left empty and untouched for what looked like years, dust settling over old furniture draped in white cloth. "This was my grandmother's kitchen," Alexander explained, gesturing around the space. "Before the main kitchens were expanded generations ago. She used to cook here herself, I am told, before duty and expectation decided such things were beneath a duchess's dignity." Lena looked around the room with quiet fascination, imagining a version of Wraithmore, where warmth and simplicity had once had a place before ambition pushed it aside. "I thought," Alexander continued, somewhat hesitantly, "that if you wished, this room could be restored, as a kitchen of your own. Not for the household's grand dinners, but simply for you, to cook whatever you wished, whenever you wished, without obligation or performance attached to it." Lena turned to him, surprised by the thoughtfulness behind such an offer. "You would give me this?" "I would give you far more than this, if you allowed it," Alexander said quietly. "But I thought perhaps this was a good place to begin." Something in Lena's chest ached softly at the gesture, so unlike anything she had received during the earlier, colder months of their marriage. "Thank you," she said simply, unable to find words adequate enough for what the offer truly meant to her. Not every day passed easily, however. Word of Julian's upcoming trial brought renewed attention to Wraithmore, and with it, renewed gossip that occasionally turned unkind. Some among the county's nobility whispered that Lena had orchestrated the entire scandal herself, using clever manipulation to secure her place at Alexander's side. Others suggested that Alexander's sudden devotion was nothing more than guilt dressed up as affection, destined to fade once the excitement of scandal wore away. Lena tried not to let such whispers reach her, but on particularly difficult days, doubt crept in regardless. She thought of Julian's parting words in the garden weeks before, his warning that Alexander never kept interest in anything for long. She wondered, in her quieter moments, whether she was simply the latest cause he had taken up, destined to be replaced by his next distraction once the novelty faded. One evening, unable to shake such doubts, she found herself unusually quiet during dinner, picking at her food rather than eating it. "Something is troubling you," Alexander observed, setting down his own fork. Lena hesitated before answering honestly. "I have heard the whispers about why you have changed so suddenly toward me. I find myself wondering, sometimes, if this is simply guilt rather than something that will last." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, considering his response carefully, rather than offering an easy reassurance. "I cannot promise you certainty," he said finally. "I can only tell you that what I feel toward you now has grown slowly, through months of watching you remain steady and honest, even when this entire household treated you unfairly. That is not something guilt alone could create. Guilt fades quickly. This has not." Lena studied his face, searching for the reassurance she needed, and found something steady and unwavering looking back at her. "I want to believe that," she admitted quietly. "Then allow me the time to prove it," Alexander said, "not through words alone, but through everything that follows." Lena nodded slowly, the doubt in her chest easing, though not disappearing entirely. Trust, she reminded herself, could not be rebuilt in a single conversation, no matter how sincere. It would take time, patience, and consistency, qualities she was only beginning to see steadily emerge in the man across from her. For now, she decided, that was enough to continue forward. Julian's trial took place at the county courthouse on a gray morning several weeks later, drawing a crowd of curious onlookers, eager to witness the fall of a man once considered untouchable due to his family connections. Alexander attended, along with Edwin Foley and the evidence they had carefully compiled, while Lena remained at Wraithmore at Alexander's gentle suggestion, sparing her the discomfort of facing Julian publicly again. The proceedings were swift, given the strength of the evidence. Julian's solicitor attempted various defenses, none of which held against the forged signatures, the traced accounts, and the witnessed attempt to destroy evidence. By early afternoon, the magistrate delivered his final judgment. Julian was found guilty of fraud and forgery, stripped of any remaining claim to the Castellane family estate, and sentenced to several years of confinement, along with a substantial fine to be paid toward restoring Lena's reputation and covering the costs of the investigation. Julian showed no remorse as the verdict was read, only cold resignation, his gaze fixed somewhere in the distance rather than on anyone in the courtroom. Alexander returned to Wraithmore that evening, feeling a strange mixture of relief and heaviness, the closure of the ordeal bringing satisfaction, though tempered by the sad reality of watching a member of his own family fall so completely due to greed and resentment. He found Lena waiting for him in the small private dining room, a simple meal already prepared, the same steady care she always brought to such gestures evident in every detail. "It is finished," he said, taking his seat across from her. "Julian has been sentenced. He will not trouble this family again." Lena felt the last remaining tension in her shoulders ease at the confirmation. "Then it is truly over." "The trial is over," Alexander agreed. "But I find myself hoping this is only the beginning of something else entirely." Lena looked up at him, curious at the shift in his tone. "What do you mean?" Alexander reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document, setting it carefully on the table between them. Lena recognized it immediately as the original marriage contract, the arrangement that had bound them together without either of their genuine consent from the very beginning. "I want to tear this apart," Alexander said quietly. "Not to end our marriage, but to remove the obligation that has always shadowed it. I do not want you bound to me through a contract arranged to save my family's finances. If we are to continue this marriage, I want it to exist because you have chosen it freely, not because circumstance forced it upon you." Lena stared at the document, understanding the significance of what he was offering. "And if I choose not to remain, then you would leave with everything you are rightfully owed, and my sincere gratitude for the ways you have changed this house, and changed me, simply through your presence within it," Alexander said. "But I am hoping, quite selfishly, that you will choose to stay." Lena felt tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming weight of finally being offered a genuine choice after a year of feeling as though she had none at all. "Why now?" she asked softly. "Why tear it apart now, rather than simply letting the marriage continue as it already stands?" "Because you deserve better than an arrangement," Alexander said, his voice steady, despite the vulnerability behind his words. "You deserve a partner who chooses you deliberately, every day, rather than one bound to you by circumstance alone. I want to be that partner, if you will allow it." Lena reached across the table and picked up the old contract, feeling the weight of the paper that had defined the beginning of their relationship without either of their genuine consent. "Tear it," she said finally, her voice steady with quiet resolve. "Let us begin again, properly, without obligation, shadowing whatever comes next." Alexander's hands trembled slightly as he took the document back, and together, they tore it slowly in half, the sound of ripping paper carrying a symbolic weight that neither of them needed to explain aloud. In the days that followed, Alexander proposed a new arrangement entirely, one built not on family finances or political convenience, but on genuine partnership. He offered Lena full ownership of the restored kitchen in his grandmother's old sitting room, along with resources to expand it into something larger, should she ever wish to share her cooking beyond the walls of Wraithmore. He began involving her in estate decisions as well, valuing her perspective in ways he had never considered doing during the earlier months of their marriage. Slowly, steadily, the dynamic between them shifted from duke and obligated wife into something that resembled true partnership, built on mutual respect rather than hierarchy alone. The Dowager Duchess, though still adjusting to the changes within her household, found herself softening gradually as well, occasionally joining Lena in the restored kitchen to share quiet conversations over tea, a small but meaningful step toward reconciliation that neither of them rushed. Lena, for her part, found herself trusting the transformation more each day, watching Alexander's consistency prove itself through countless small moments rather than grand gestures alone. The doubt that had lingered after Julian's cruel warning began to fade, replaced slowly by something steadier, something that felt, for the first time in her life, genuinely secure. Spring arrived at Wraithmoor, with a warmth the estate had not felt in years, the gardens blooming fuller than Lena remembered from the previous season, as though even the grounds themselves had softened alongside the household they surrounded. She stood on the balcony one morning, tending to her herbs, now grown thick and abundant across several pots, rather than the single small one she had once carefully guarded as her only piece of home. Alexander joined her, as he often did now, carrying 2 cups of tea and handing one to her, before leaning against the railing beside her. "The kitchen is nearly finished," he said. "Edwin tells me the final renovations should be complete by the end of the week." Lena smiled, thinking of the space that had once sat forgotten and dusty, now transformed into something warm and functional, waiting to become the heart of a home rather than a relic of forgotten history. "I have been thinking about what to cook first, once it is ready." "Something simple?" Alexander asked, a small, teasing smile tugging at his mouth, an expression that had grown more natural on his face with each passing month. "Something meaningful," Lena corrected, "though perhaps it will end up being simple as well. The best things usually are." They stood together in comfortable silence for a while, watching the morning light spread slowly across the gardens below. So much had changed since the night she had stood before the entire household, accused and humiliated, requesting nothing more than one final chance to offer something honest before leaving forever. She had never imagined that request would become the beginning of everything that followed. "I received a letter this morning," Alexander said eventually, "from a family in the next county. They have heard of your cooking, apparently through Clara's rather enthusiastic storytelling during her visits home, and they wish to know if you would consider preparing a meal for a small gathering they are hosting next month." Lena raised an eyebrow, surprised. "They wish to hire me? A duchess?" "They wish to experience what I experienced that first night," Alexander said. "Something tells me it will not be the last such request, once word continues to spread." Lena considered the idea, something warm blooming in her chest at the thought of her mother's recipes reaching beyond the walls of this estate, carrying the same comfort to strangers that they had once carried to her as a lonely, grieving child. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "this could become something larger than I ever imagined. Not just a kitchen for myself, but a place where others could taste that same comfort." "I would support whatever you wish to build," Alexander said, his voice steady with sincerity. "This estate, this family, all of it belongs to you now, as much as it belongs to me. Whatever you choose to create within it, I intend to stand beside you fully." Lena turned to look at him, searching his face one final time for any remaining trace of the cold, distant man she had first married a year and a half ago. She found none. Only warmth, steady and unwavering, built patiently through months of honesty rather than obligation. "Then let us build it together," she said softly. That evening, the newly restored kitchen welcomed its first true meal, prepared not for a hearing, not for a final farewell, but for a quiet celebration between 2 people who had chosen each other freely, without contract or circumstance dictating the terms. Lena moved comfortably through the space, teaching Alexander small tasks as he attempted, somewhat clumsily, to assist her. Laughter filling a room that had sat silent and forgotten for generations before finding new life once more. The Dowager Duchess joined them briefly, offering quiet praise for the meal that surprised everyone present, including herself. As they finally sat down together at a small table within the kitchen itself, rather than the grand formal dining hall that had once separated them so completely, Alexander reached across and took Lena's hand gently in his own. "1 year ago," he said quietly, "I could not have imagined sitting here, grateful for a life I once resented entirely." "Nor could I," Lena admitted, smiling softly. "I only asked for one chance to leave with dignity. I never expected it to become a chance to stay, and to build something real." "I am glad it did," Alexander said, his voice carrying quiet certainty. "More glad than I have words to properly express." Lena squeezed his hand gently, feeling, for the first time in her life, entirely and completely at home. Outside, the gardens continued to bloom, beneath a sky slowly darkening into evening. The estate that had once felt like a prison, now settling comfortably around them, like something finally, truly earned. The recipe that had begun as a final, desperate request had grown into something neither of them could have predicted. A reminder that sometimes, the smallest gestures carry the power to change everything, if only given the chance to be tasted fully and understood completely. And in that quiet kitchen, surrounded by warmth neither of them had known they were missing, Lena Ashworth and Alexander Castellane began, at last, the story they had both been waiting for, without ever realizing it, all along.